Buenas and welcome to the Gaming Stripes channel. My name is Jarek. First thing I would like to say is thank you for taking the time to click on this video and listening in to an old tiger ramble on about video games he likes. This is the very first video created by me, so I apologize for the subpar editing. I will be frank, I have no idea what I'm doing with the software at this time, so this is more of a pilot video and a way for myself to get my paws wet and starting something new. Once again, I appreciate for everybody clicking on this video. If you enjoyed the content, hitting the like button would be appreciated and lets me know if there's any interest in these types of videos in the future. Please feel free to leave a comment down below with any ideas on anything that you'd like me to play or anything that I can do to improve my videos. So with that out of the way, welcome to my top 10 RPGs of all time. Shining the Holy Ark might not be familiar to a lot of you. Honestly, since this game came out in the Sega Saturn back in December of 1996, this game is a lot older than most of the people probably watching this video. This game is literally old enough to drink at this point. Poor joke aside, Shining the Holy Ark feels more like a building block RPG. And what I mean about that is, it feels more like the ideas behind this game are what culminated into another game series that a lot of people are more familiar with. I was gonna say which game it's connected to, but honestly I kinda wanna see what people say in the comments down below as to which game this reminds them of. Moving further, Shining the Holy Ark is a spin-off of the Shining Force series, and being a spin-off of the series, it does have quite a bit changes compared to the Shining Force games. In the Shining Force games, you're typically fighting in a tactical combat system, while in Shining the Holy Ark, it's more of a first-person, turn-based combat system. You play the game as Arthur, a mercenary swordsman that is hired to hunt a ninja named Rhodey. During the opening, you are joined by Melody, a healer, and Forte, a mage. As your band of heroes ends up catching up with Rhodey and battling against him, a ship collides onto the mountain that you're in, leaving Arthur and their companions severely injured by the rockfalls. The D&D nerd in me definitely wants to make a rockfalls party dies joke, but nobody in your party actually dies. At this point, one of the actual game mechanics that not a lot of people tend to notice is shown. It's at this instance that Forte is possessed by a demon and ends up being taken away. And from within the crash site of the ship, we end up seeing the three spirits that come out and actually support your main characters, which are Rhodey, Melody, and Arthur. Now, Arthur, Rhodey, and Melody have been really severely injured to the point where Rhodey actually had brain damage, while Arthur and Melody had pretty much most of their internal organs destroyed, along with a few broken ribs. The three spirits ended up fusing themselves with the three heroes, which allows them to pretty much revive themselves at any point. And that's one of the mechanics in the game that I've seen a lot of people not actually mention. While with your other party members, if they do die in combat and you do not resurrect them, you have to go to the church to get them resurrected. While Rhodey, Melody, and Arthur, if they die in combat and you finish the fight, they will always return back to life with 1 HP. This is definitely a pretty interesting way to actually bring that mechanic into the game and kind of explain it. As a typical turn-based RPG, you progress through the story, unlock new characters, new weapons, new armor, new spells, new abilities, summons, all the while the party's actually traversing through a varied selection of locales. The game being on the Sega Saturn doesn't give it any flair when it comes to the graphics and performance, but it does give it one option that actually makes it stand up above many other games, and that is the soundtrack. If by this point of this section you haven't figured out what game I'm talking about that this is connected to, then let's take a listen to the battle theme and let me know in the comments below which game do you think this reminds you of the most. With that being said, Shining the Holy Ark is a fantastic game that I would recommend anyone giving a shot if you get a chance to play it. I know it's going to be hard to find a copy of this game, since it's fairly hard to actually find an actual console to play the game with. If you're lucky enough to get your hands on both the console and the game, I highly recommend playing it. Shining the Holy Ark is a fantastic RPG that I tend to go back to play at least once every few years. Ars Technica 2 by today's standards would be a very controversial game, due to the way that it portrays certain elements of its stories, and of course with all of the innuendos all over the place. Looking past all those dated stereotypes, being that it was a PS2 game, this game series actually hired a linguist to create a unique language from scratch. The language is called Hymnos, and it's an integral part of the game's world and story. The game takes place in a fictional world called RCL, a world where music has the power of creation and destruction. Think of it like magic, but with music instead. The only ones able to weave such music are called Raventails. They are in a sense an artificial being that is connected to a network that governs the world. Without going too much into spoiler territories, the main goal of the game is to find and understand the song of creation called Metaphalica. This fabled song is the only way to save RCL from its impending doom. Now, when it comes to the gameplay of Artanelico, it is a little bit unique in some aspects. Going back to what I said at the beginning of my conversation here, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room. In Artanelico 2, you have a dating sim mechanic in the game, just like the first one. I'm not sure if calling it a dating mechanic is the right way of explaining it, but that's the closest thing that I can come up with. Being that the Raventails are artificial beings, you take them to what they call a dive shop, and within this dive shop, you actually connect to their subconscious into a virtual world, and within this virtual world, you actually help them overcome any hardships, any trials, tribulations that they've had in the past, along with assisting them in building stronger magics due to their connection that they build with you. As you dive deeper into what they call their cosmospheres, you begin to form deeper relationships with the Raventails, which allows them to actually build stronger magics that can help you out in combat. Yes, it is as odd as it sounds. Another aspect of the game is the bathhouse. Yes, a bathhouse. No, not talking about horny on main here. The bathhouse scenes are relegated specifically and only for the Raventails. Since the Raventails are all female, then this would just be a bathhouse specifically for them. And just think of it as girls' nights out. This is used as a way to strengthen the bonds between the singers so that they become better in battle and are able to synchronize with one another to make their spells stronger. In combat, there's a unique mechanic where you have 2 vanguards and the 2 singers. Combat begins where you select a song and which singer will sing it. Once you select and activate the song, the real combat actually starts. Once it begins, you will notice that your Raventails MP starts draining, and your Vanguard team actually has access to start attacking the enemies. With each successful attack, you will actually start to do a synchronization between the actual Vanguards and the singers, which helps build up their meter and their damage. Once your Vanguard's turn is over and it's the enemy's turn, the game changes more to a rhythm style game at this point. Your Vanguards go into a defensive style and you have to press either square or X in time to each of the enemy's attacks to prevent damage to your Raventails. I will just say that some of the attacks get very annoying. Taking into consideration the dive mechanic and the bathhouse mechanics, the bonds between the characters are actually very important to the game's combat. With a stronger bond between the Raventails, you unlock a new mechanic called Synchronity Chain. As cheesy as it sounds, Synchronity Chain allows the Raventails to sync both their hearts and their music into one. This will greatly boost how fast the music powers up and how much damage it'll end up doing in the end. And it also comes with a flashy cutscene in the process. Artanelico 2 is all about the music, and the in-game soundtrack also complements the game. Tracks being sung using the actual Hymnos language are hauntingly beautiful. It is an unknown language to our ears, which makes it even more appealing and interesting in the end. If you ever get a chance to find a copy of this game on the PS2, I highly recommend it. It might not be a perfect game, but it does have a heartwarming story, and the music is top-notch. Atelier Iris 2 is another PS2 RPG from a very long-running series currently spanning 22 games. The Atelier games always called my attention due to the theme of alchemy, something that has actually interested me since I was young. Atelier Iris 2 starts in a floating continent of Eden. The 2 protagonists, Felt and Vise, are alchemists in training. During the mastery test of alchemy, Vise becomes the next full-fledged alchemist. As the first task for Vise as a full-fledged alchemist, she has to go and make a pact with an elemental spirit in the forest nearby the town. While they're making their way to the elemental spirit, Felt stumbles onto a sword that has never been seen by anybody and ends up being able to pull it from its spot. You find out that this is the Azure Asoth, one of 2 magical blades. From within the blade, he hears a voice speaking to him, telling him of an important impending disaster, which ends up kickstarting the adventure to another world. Due to these turns of event, Vise and Felt are actually separated for the first time in their lives. As preparation for what's going to happen, Vise creates a ring that she gives to Felt, which allows him to transfer items back and forth between worlds. This actually becomes an integral mechanic in the game, since Felt is not an alchemist himself, but only an apprentice, and Vise is a full-fledged alchemist. This will actually allow you to control both characters and instances. You can switch to Vise whenever you need to craft alchemic items, and you can switch to Felt to further along the story. While combat is a typical turn-based system, a unique bar shows who's next in line to attack. Knowing this, you can use certain attacks to either interrupt or delay the enemies, giving you more chance to damage the enemies before they give a chance to attack. This can also be used to allow a healer to heal the party before you end up taking a mortal blow. Atelier Iris 2 might not be a perfect RPG, but it has enough merits to gain a spot in my RPG list. I highly would recommend it. Next on the list is Golden Sun for the Game Boy Advance. If you're still with me on this video and you said earlier that Shining the Holy Ark looks a lot like Golden Sun, you are correct in that assumption. Most of the team members behind Shining the Holy Ark ended up creating Camelot, the makers of Golden Sun. The game literally thrusts you into a catastrophe at the very beginning. You play as Isaac and wake up in your bedroom as a child. Thunder, lightning, and earth shaking. Your mother rushes you out the house. Here is where you find out about the world and the abilities that humans have in this world. Psi powers, akin to psychic powers. This gives the players the ability to move objects without actually touching them. Without spoiling anything at the start of the game, because it is a scene worth experiencing. After the opening scene, you take control of Isaac when he's older. A new catastrophic event hits his town. You are then pulled into a huge adventure for the safety of the world and the balance of the elements. Each weapon in the game brings its own enhancement to the combat system. Every weapon has its own special attacks, which ends up replacing what normally would be considered a critical hit in a normal RPG. Each of these attacks can be flashy to an absurd degree, but it also kinda pulls you through to want to see what each weapon has to offer. As I mentioned earlier, the game is heavily influenced by elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. Each party member has their own element behind them. Isaac is earth. This will come into play as you travel through the world and end up running into creatures called djinns. They will either join you or fight you on sight. As you collect these djinns, you can actually assign them to party members. This will open up new jobs, new skills, and new abilities for each of the party members. While you might think it's good to give all the water djinns to the water elemental fighter, it is actually best to mix and match them to gain better stats and different jobs for them. It won't really take you long to beat Golden Sun. The reason behind it is because Golden Sun and Golden Sun 2 were supposed to be one single game. Due to development deadlines, of course, this is what caused the game to be split into two. But you can still play both of the games and carry on your save data from Golden Sun 1 and Golden Sun 2, but it requires you to enter a lengthy code just to be able to transfer that data over. As most of you will probably figure out, I'm going to be gushing about the soundtrack of Golden Sun. I don't think there is a single track in the game that I dislike. Isaac's battle theme is actually in most of my playlists. If by any chance you happen to have a GBA and find a copy of the game, or if you have a Wii U, you can download the game from the Wii U store. I would highly recommend picking up this game and giving it a go. Phantasy Star 4 is a Genesis gem that is often overlooked by a lot of players. A lot of the people do not remember this game series since it was overshadowed by its online counterpart Phantasy Star Online. Phantasy Star 4 takes place in the Algo system. This star system is being ravaged by the evil presence named Dark Falls. It has corrupted and destroyed many of the civilizations over the years. You take charge of Alice and Chaz, a duo of mercenaries that are hired to exterminate monsters that have appeared abruptly in the basement of a university. As you fight your way through the basement and make your way to the final chambers, you end up finding that there are pods that were used to incubate the monsters. Alice begins to question the pods themselves, and she comes to confront the principal of the university to ask for answers. The duos are sent to Birth Valley, where they find the team that was sent to investigate being turned into stone by a dark mage named Zio. At this point I will refrain from explaining more of the story because it is worth playing. I will only hint at the fact that you're actually able to travel through space and actually go visit different planets and satellites. With space travel involved, the scope is actually fairly big for the game. It was mind-blowing for somebody at my age. Moving on to the gameplay, there were two mechanics that actually stood out to me the most. First one is a macro system. This macro system allowed you to shortcut attacks and select presets to use in combat for faster activation. This system was useful due to the high random encounter rate the game has, and allowed you to push through the combat faster than selecting all of the attacks manually. The second system is a combo system, a system that allowed you to mix and match different spells and abilities to create devastating and flashy attacks. It was not just locked to spell on spell or ability on ability. You can create a new skill by just mixing a spell and an ability together. At the time, it took a long time to figure out what all the combos were. Remember, the internet was not as plentiful as it is now. A lot of this stuff was done by trial and error, and my jaw would drop when a new combo was found. Another thing about this game that took me by surprise was just the combat system and animations. I was so used to other RPGs where there was little to no animation when attacks were being done. Phantasy Star 4 actually had a third-person view from behind your team. As each attack took place, your characters would attack accordingly. If they were melee, they would actually move up to the enemies and attack with their corresponding weapons. Dual-wielding weapons also had their own unique attacks. It was refreshing to see such animations put into the game after being so used to seeing the animations in games like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Phantasy Star 4 was the last solo-player RPG that Sega made with the franchise. I'm still holding my breath for Sega to reconsider and make a remake of Phantasy Star 3 and 4. They did so with Phantasy Star 1 and 2 with the Sega Ages collection. Phantasy Star 4 deserves a new lease on life, and the series needs to return back to its roots of a solo epic sci-fi adventures. If you're a fan of both RPGs and sci-fi, I urge you to pick up a copy of this game. You can find it on Steam for fairly cheap. Next on the list is Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals. This game confused me when I was a kid. Mainly because Lufia 2 you would think is the second part of the game, but it's actually a prequel to Lufia 1. The story takes place in a vibrant and unique world, one currently being guided by higher beings called the Sinistrals, godlike figures with terrifying power. You play as Maxim, a mercenary who just returned back from hunting monsters. He learns that work is getting thin for mercenaries. Lack of monsters to hunt is causing the job to be less desirable, until he hears that monsters have appeared in the northern dungeon and goes to explore. This, like many other RPGs, ends up pulling him into a series of events that place him in the forefront of a battle for the safety of the world. Lufia 2 is your typical turn-based RPG with a twist. While in the overworld, you have random encounters and you explore and travel around. But when you're in dungeons, this is when things get interesting. While in the dungeons there are no random encounters, you see the enemies on the screen and you can try to avoid them, but there's a catch. The enemies only move when you do, so you have to think and act in a way to stun the enemies with the tools that you have, and once the enemy is stunned, it's your choice to decide whether you want to avoid or sneak attack them. This turns what would normally be a regular dungeon into a puzzle in itself. Talking about puzzles, every dungeon is littered with puzzles to solve. Some are fairly easy to figure out, while others are a pain in the rear when I was younger, especially the ultimate trick in the game, which is a sliding block puzzle from hell. I still remember when Nintendo had the cheat support line where you would call in for support on games, and they would not accept calls for this puzzle. Another feature in the game is the capsule monsters. You find them randomly across the world's dungeons. This adds an AI party member monster that you can raise by feeding them items. You can also evolve them into stronger forms, each with their own unique attacks and abilities. This was a fun system to mess with and learn on how to unlock their master forms. Too bad that they died too fast in combat. Lufia 2 also introduced an unexpected feature that I had not seen in a game at the time for the Super Nintendo. A randomly generated dungeon spanning 100 floors. Yes, a fully randomly generated dungeon just as an extra content. Still not sure if there's any other SNES RPGs with this feature. Feel free to name any if you might know down below. It was a fun side adventure that you can take, and actually some of the items can also be extracted and used in your actual gameplay. Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals makes it to my top 5 RPGs of all times. It has and still holds its place on my top 5. I will always recommend this game to anyone who asks me for a good RPG. Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana has literally become my favorite RPG of the last generation. Saying last generation since PS5 and Xbox Series X just launched not long ago. Ys 8 is another one of the long-running Ys series games, going back to 1987. Holy hell, I feel old. I was 4 years old when this first game came out. Yep, I'm old, not gonna hide the fact. Ys' main protagonist is Adol Christian, a red-haired badass hero that spans 8 full games as the main character. Ys 8 is currently his biggest outing and my #1 favorite in the series. Adol is continuing his adventures with his friend Dogi. They secure a ride on the Lombardia by joining the crew as payment for passage. After a banquet that was held on the ship, the captain notices that they had drifted too close to the island of Seiren, a cursed island that no one has made it back alive from. The Lombardia is attacked by a kraken-like beast and destroyed, being pulled down under the waves. Adol wakes up washed up ashore on the island of Seiren and begins his adventure to find any survivors in his way off the island. You start by building a base of operation that you use to house all of the survivors that you find across the island. This base is called Castaway Village. As you progress through the story, Castaway Village will be attacked by monsters, which will require you to rush back and protect it from the attacks. This adds some random urgency to the protection of the village while also adding a new gameplay element akin to tower defense. During these raids, you end up going from wave to wave of enemies as you protect the town. Ys 8 combat is full action. This means you control every blow and action in combat. You have combos you can perform and specials you can use as long as you have SP to spend on them. While you can level grind in the game, you don't really need to since it's all about managing your dodges and blocks as you attack. The game has a perfect dodge block system. So if you perfect dodge an attack, you gain an attack speed boost. If you perfect block an attack, you gain a crit boost. Each of these will slow down the world around your character, giving you a bullet time style effect in combat. In combat, you also have to manage the weakness of the enemies you are fighting against. The game has a slashing, piercing, and blunt wheel that works like rock, paper, scissors. Some enemy types are weak to slashing, and some piercing, and some to blunt. It's pretty easy to figure out due to the monsters being grouped into certain categories. Flying will be weak to piercing, shelled enemies or armored enemies will be weak to blunt, and so on. This adds another layer of complexity to the game, but can be ignored if you overlevel and just brute force your way through combat. Now to the obligatory gushing of the soundtrack. And holy hell is the soundtrack good in this game. Every single track is memorable and pump you up for battle or stab you in the heart with feels. Nihon Falcom are masterclass at their craft of music. Ys 8 has a varied selection of tracks from somber to punctuate the lows of the story, and a mix of heavy metal beats with killer guitar riffs to get you hyped for combat. If it feels that I'm excited to talk about this game, it is because I love this game. This is the single PS4 game that I have gotten a platinum trophy for. Those that know me know I am not a trophy hunter, and I don't really care about getting 100% on games. Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana was just that good. Get a copy of the game on PS4, Switch, or PC. It is worth a playthrough for the story and the amazing music. This next game will get mixed response from people, being that it is an MMORPG and it requires a monthly fee to play the game. Final Fantasy XIV has become my favorite Final Fantasy game ever made. The game throws you into a deep and engaging story that you play as the Warrior of Light, the vaunted hero that is there to save the world from danger and destruction. What sets Final Fantasy apart from other MMOs is the way that it handles the story. The story is the main content of the game. While other MMOs have story to them, it's not always the main content of the game. The story in many of them are told by either side quests or random books you find across the world. This might be negative to some, but Final Fantasy XIV forces you to do the story to progress and unlock the other content in the game. If you want to see the next expansion story, you have to complete the base game and the expansion before that to get to the new content. This can be annoying to many players, but the story that it brings to the table is one that has only improved with time. The story is told in such a way that it puts you at the forefront of the world's problems. The narrative revolves around you and not an NPC hero. To many, this gives them the reason to want to play and continue the game because the story feels like a single-player game. Final Fantasy XIV has the base game and 3 expansions under its belt at this time. A Realm Reborn is the base story. ARR builds your story as an adventurer chosen by the goddess as the Warrior of Light, while leading up to the first expansion. Heaven's Word is the first expansion that cohesively connects ARR to its story, sending you to the lands of Dravania to help end a 1,000-year war with the dragons. To me, this is the reason why I enjoy Final Fantasy XIV so much, is the way the story is told and experienced. Final Fantasy XIV storytelling to the start is not perfect to begin with, but it gets better as you go through each expansion. They learn from the prior expansion and improve upon it as they go. Final Fantasy XIV's gameplay is fun and challenging while also being fair. Unlike other MMOs where you normally would have to create multiple characters to play different job classes, this game allows you to be a single character and level up every single job in the game. This can save time from having to do the story quest missions over and over again with each new character. This game has a total of 17 playable combat classes that you can actually do the entire story with. Final Fantasy XIV might not be a game for everyone, but if you really enjoy the Final Fantasy series, you might want to give the free trial a shot and see what you think. Square Enix is giving players the ability to play the game online free up to the first expansion of Heaven's Word. This means that you can experience the base story, the first expansion, and level up to 60 and try the jobs up to that point. While you are limited to certain factors, it is still a good entry point to the game. I will recommend at least a free trial to anyone thinking about playing the game. Final Fantasy XIV not only has a great story to experience, it also has one of the largest collection of music from the Final Fantasy franchise, currently holding an award for the most original scores in a single game, pushing over 380 tracks. Final Fantasy XIV is worth a play of the free trial at least, and if you already play the game, let me know below what data center and server you're located in. Next on the list is a game that needs little to no introduction. Xenoblade Chronicles is a game that if you have not played at all, you would at least know the main protagonist thanks to his inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Xenoblade takes place in the world of the Bionis and the Mechonis, 2 giant godlike beings that were locked in combat for a long time. After a long struggle, both gods wound one another and fall into a death-like slumber for years. You take control of Shulk at Colony 9, just having a typical day of salvaging parts to help build new weapons. Colony 9 is then attacked by the Mechon and the story is brought to a quick and heavy start. I will not spoil any of the story because I urge you to play the game on your own and experience it. Combat in Xenoblade is a mix of action with an auto attack system tied to it. You have free movement of your character around the combat field, and if you're close enough to the enemy, you will auto attack. You have access to an art palette that you can expend to do damage to the enemies with these abilities. Once you use them, they will go into a cooldown timer before you can use them again. Each art has added benefits when being used from either behind or flanking the enemy. Arts can also inflict debuffs on the enemies, which will allow your party members to stun or topple them. Xenoblade originally came out on the Wii. This game has huge maps to explore, which took me by surprise at the scale and scope of each location. This was completely unexpected for a Wii title. While the graphics on the Wii were not groundbreaking, the size of the world and the story were captivating enough to gain it my number 2 spot. Without spoiling any more of the game, I will say that strap in for a fantastic sci-fi adventure, coupled with a killer soundtrack. You can easily pick this game up on the Switch, and I highly recommend picking that version up over the 3DS or the Wii versions. With the Switch version, you get the same masterclass story and gameplay, but with a graphical boost and added content. Xenoblade on the Switch added a new story that continues after the end of the original one, expanding more on Shulk and another character I will not name whose story was not fully fleshed out in the original game. I can almost guarantee you will love this game if you play it. Now to my number 1 RPG of all time, and would also end up in my number 1 game of all times. To no surprise to anyone that knows me, Chrono Trigger gets that honor. I could sit here and talk about Chrono Trigger for hours, but I won't bore you on that unless you want to hear my detailed explanation or a review. I'll save that for another video. Chrono Trigger is a masterclass RPG that melts time travel with turn-based combat in such a fantastic way. The combat is simple and can be very tactical even for a turn-based game. Enemies will move around the field and your attacks can connect with multiple enemies depending on the move. Take for instance Chrono's Cyclone attack. The game also introduces dual and triple techs that can unleash some spectacular attacks to do some massive damage. The game's not long either. You can beat it in roughly 20 hours on a fresh new playthrough if you've never played the game. But don't let the playtime fool you. This game popularized New Game Plus mode. This allows you to restart your game carrying your levels, stats, and many of the items you've collected. You might ask, why even bother if you already beat the game once? Well, the reason for the short gameplay is the fact that the game includes time travel. This alone opens up the window to multiple endings depending on when you face the final boss in the story. Originally, the game only had 13 endings. An additional one was added for the remake on the DS. Chrono Trigger is the only game that I have ended up loving every character in your party. You genuinely fall in love with them as you progress through the story. Every time I got a brand new character in the party, I always felt bad about leaving one of the other ones behind. In the second half of the game, party member-specific quest lines are brought into play that deepens your connections to them. I won't spoil any of it, but each of them are worth playing through. You will learn more about the characters and what they've gone through before they met you. Finally, the music in this game is just so damn good. Yasunori Mitsuda has created some of the best audio tracks for this game and even ended up falling ill in the process. This is the first game that he was given full control over the music. It shows he pours his heart and soul into the game's soundtrack. If I were to make a top 10 best RPG music soundtracks made, Chrono Trigger would end up being in the number 1 spot also. Chrono Trigger is hands down one of the best games ever made and stands to this day. It's a simple and deep game at the same time. You can sit down and beat the game in a 2-day play span. But to fully complete the game and experience the story, you have to play it multiple times. I highly recommend this game to anyone who has never heard of it or played it. You can find this game on the SNES, DS, PlayStation, and Steam. The Steam version and the DS version are the definitive versions of the game because of the added story that was included. This game is a game I go back and play multiple times a year since its launch. The game is a timeless masterpiece. Sorry for the long video. Thank you for sitting through to the end and for any feedback below. Have a wonderful day.